Close your eyes for a second and let the morning come back to you. It's a little before 8, the grass still holds last night's frost, and your breath hangs white in the air as you walk that gravel road with a lunch pail swinging from your hand. Somewhere ahead, over the rise, a bell begins to ring, one clear iron note rolling out across the fields, and every kid within 2 miles knows exactly what it means. There was a whole world tucked inside that single room, a world of wood smoke and chalk dust and the smell of wet wool drying by the stove. And here's the question that stays with the folks who lived it. How did one teacher, one room, and 8 grades all crammed together somehow raise some of the finest people this country ever produced? Let's walk back through those doors and find out. Start with that bell up in the little cupola. It wasn't decoration, it was the town clock, the alarm, and the heartbeat of the whole community. When the teacher pulled that rope, the sound carried across cornfields and pastures for a mile or more, and mothers on porches knew their children were safe and accounted for. There's a boy still alive somewhere who remembers being the one chosen to ring it, standing on tiptoe, feeling that rope buck and jump in his hands. That bell said the day had begun, and when it rang, you ran the last stretch so you wouldn't be late. Then there was the potbelly stove, squatting black and heavy near the middle of the room. On a January morning, it was the whole reason you didn't freeze, and the kids whose desks sat closest guarded that privilege like gold. The teacher would send an older boy out before dawn to split kindling and get it roaring, so by the time the little ones filed in, the iron was ticking and popping with heat. You could smell wet mittens steaming on the fender and cold apples warming on the windowsill above it. That stove taught you something quiet, that warmth was work, and somebody always had to rise in the dark to make it. Which brings us to the water bucket and the dipper. One galvanized pail sat on a bench by the door, filled fresh each morning from the pump outside, and every child in that room drank from the same tin dipper. Nobody thought a single thing of it. You'd come in from recess with your cheeks red and your nose running, hang your coat on a nail, and take a long, cold pull of well water that tasted faintly of iron and earth. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, and yet it bound you together. One bucket, one dipper, one family of mere strangers who somehow weren't strangers at all. You can't forget the slate and the little squeak of the slate pencil against it. Before paper was cheap enough to waste, you did your sums on a small framed chalkboard balanced on your knee, and the sound of 30 children scratching away at once was like a whole field full of crickets. When you finished, you'd wipe it clean with a damp rag, or a shirt sleeve if the teacher wasn't watching, and start fresh. A girl who grew up to be a schoolteacher herself once said she could still feel the chill of that slate under her palm on a winter morning. It taught you that mistakes weren't permanent. You just wiped them away and worked the sum again. There was the recitation bench up front, the worn wooden pew where each grade took its turn while the others studied. As the teacher worked with the third graders on their reading, the rest of you kept your heads down over your own lessons, but you were always listening. That was the secret nobody had to plan. The little ones soaked up the older kids' geography, and the big ones stayed sharp reviewing the little ones' spelling. A 5-year-old learned his multiplication tables by pure osmosis, hearing them chanted a dozen times a day. One room, and somehow every single mind in it was being fed at once. And of course there was the McGuffey reader, that little brown book passed down until the spine finally gave out. It wasn't just words on a page. Every story carried a lesson about honesty, courage, kindness, and hard work. You learned to read, and you learned how to be a decent person in the very same breath. Grandparents handed their worn copies down to grandchildren, the margins filled with 3 generations of penciled names. Those readers shaped the moral backbone of half of rural America, one short lesson at a time. Think of the outhouse out back, And don't laugh. Every kid who went there remembers the January dash. 20 yards across frozen ground, the wind cutting straight through your coat, and that plank seat cold enough to take your breath clean away. There was a Sears catalog hanging on a nail, and you know exactly what it was for. It wasn't comfortable, and it surely wasn't private, but nobody complained, because complaining just wasn't something you did. You ran out fast, ran back faster, and got yourself close to that stove. Now here's something folks forget entirely. The older kids raised the younger ones. If your little sister was crying because she couldn't tie her boots or work her arithmetic, it was your job to help her, right there at your desk. The big boys carried the coal and the water. The big girls minded the babies and the beginners. And everyone understood that you were responsible for someone smaller than yourself. That wasn't a chore anybody resented. That was character being poured into you before you even knew it was happening. The lunch pail deserves its own moment. A lard tin or a syrup bucket, packed that morning with a cold biscuit, maybe a boiled egg, a slice of ham, and an apple from the cellar. There were no cafeterias and no hot meals, just what your mother could spare. And some years that wasn't much at all. Kids who had a little extra shared with the kids who had none, and nobody ever made a show of it. That quiet generosity passed hand to hand under the desks was about the truest thing that room ever taught. Recess was a whole education all by itself. No playground equipment, no swings bought from a catalog, just a bare dirt yard, a stick, a ball made of wound-up twine, and every bit of imagination you could muster. You played Annie over, throwing the ball across the schoolhouse roof, or Red Rover, or you just ran until your lungs burned in the cold air. A man in his 80s can still tell you the exact spot where he cracked a home run past the fence line back in 1949. You made your own fun, and it was better fun for having made it yourself. There was always the teacher who boarded with a local family, moving from farmhouse to farmhouse across the school year. She was often barely older than her oldest students, maybe 17 or 18. And she taught all 8 grades, tended the stove, disciplined the rowdy boys, and swept the floor at the end of every day besides. She earned maybe $30 a month and considered herself fortunate to have the work. That young woman held the whole future of a township in her 2 hands, and most of them never got a proper word of thanks until 50 years too late. Don't overlook the little handbell on her desk, the small brass one she rang to call you back in from recess. That sound meant the fun was over and lessons had resumed. And even now, some old-timers swear they hear it ringing in their sleep. She'd stand framed in the doorway, apron on, and give it 3 sharp shakes. You'd drop your game right in the middle of a motion and line up. Because when the teacher rang, you came. Some things you never had to be told twice in that place. Remember the ink well set into the corner of each desk and the steel nib pen you dipped down into it. Your penmanship was graded just as carefully as your spelling, and a blot on your paper felt like a small tragedy. There's a whole generation whose handwriting is still lovely to this day because a country teacher stood over them insisting on it. And there was always one boy who dipped a girl's pigtail into that inkwell and always got the switch for it. That ink stained your fingers blue and stained your memory for the rest of your life. The Friday spelling bee was the great event of the week. You'd stand in a line along the wall, and one by one the teacher would call out a word, and one by one kids would sit back down until only the champion was left standing. Parents came in from their farms to watch. Winning meant something real in a town where there wasn't a whole lot else to win. A woman past 90 once told her grandchildren she could still spell Mississippi the exact way she did to take the crown in the 6th grade, and her voice cracked wide open in the telling of it. There was the flag and the morning ritual, the Pledge of Allegiance, a song, sometimes a Bible verse or the Lord's Prayer. Everyone stood, hand over heart, and for 1 full minute the whole room was pointed in the same direction. Whatever you make of it now, back then it planted something down deep. You belonged to something far bigger than your own family and your own patch of farm. That 1 minute told you so, quietly, every single morning. Think about the older boys who came late in the fall and left early in the spring. When there was a harvest to bring in or a field to plant, the farm came first, and the teacher understood it without a fuss. A 14-year-old might miss 6 weeks of school and never really fall behind because the family needed his back in the field more than the schoolhouse needed his seat filled. That was the honest rhythm of rural life, book learning bent around the land, never the other way around. Nobody thought it any kind of hardship. It was simply how the world turned out there. There was the switch behind the door and the whole understanding that came along with it. Discipline was swift and rarely questioned, and if you got the switch at school, you knew you'd get worse at home for having earned it. But here's the thing worth saying. That room was never cruel. It was firm, and firmness felt like a kind of love when you looked back on it from a distance of years. You knew exactly where the line was drawn, and there was a strange, steady comfort in knowing. Remember the double desks, 2 children sharing one bench, initials carved into the wood by kids long grown and long gone. You could trace the grooves of names from 20 years back with your fingertip during a slow afternoon lesson. The wood was worn smooth and dark from 1,000 resting elbows. When they finally tore some of those little schools down, grown men drove out and pried a single desk loose to keep out in the barn. You just don't forget the place where you learned to read. Don't forget the long walk itself. 2 miles, 3 miles, sometimes more, on foot in every kind of weather. Snow to your knees in the dead of winter, dust to your ankles in the heat of August. You walked with your brothers and sisters and the neighbor kids, and that walk was where the real friendships got forged, out on the open road with no grown-ups listening in. Old folks will tell you those walks were half the whole childhood. The schoolhouse taught you your letters, but the road taught you about life. There were the Christmas program and the last day picnic, the 2 great celebrations of the entire year. At Christmas, the whole township packed into that one warm room to watch the children recite poems by lantern light, and every last kid got an orange and a piece of hard candy. A real rare luxury. On the final day of school, families spread their quilts under the shade trees and ate fried chicken until the sun sank low. Those weren't just school events on a calendar. They were the whole social season of a community that didn't have much else. Think of the water pump and the woodpile chores that started off every single day. Hauled the water, somebody split the wood, somebody swept the floor, and somebody clapped the erasers clean out the door in a great cloud of chalk. The work was shared out fairly, and everybody did their part without being asked twice. It wasn't a punishment handed down. It was how you learned that a room, just like a farm, only runs right when everyone pitches in together. There was the smell of the whole place, and anyone who was ever there can conjure it up in an instant. Chalk dust and pine floor oil, the sharp tang of the coal stove, wet wool and pencil shavings, and the old leather of well-thumbed readers. Close your eyes right now and it comes flooding back, doesn't it? That smell is a doorway straight back to the age of 8. Some memories live in the nose long after the mind has let go of nearly everything else. And finally, there was the day they closed it, when the county consolidated the little schools and sent a big yellow bus to carry the children off into town. The bell went silent up in the cupola. The stove went stone cold, and something in that community died quietly along with it, though nobody quite said so out loud. 103. A whole way of learning and a whole way of belonging folded itself up and drove away down the gravel road for good. So, Here's the payoff to the question we started with. How did one room and one young teacher raise such strong, decent, capable people? Because that room was never really about the lessons up on the board at all. It was about the older ones carrying the younger ones, about sharing one dipper and one lunch pail, about a whole town packing in for a Christmas play by lantern light. Self-reliance and neighborliness weren't subjects anybody taught. They were the very walls of the place. Those kids learned to read, sure enough, but far more than that, they learned how to belong to one another. And that's the one thing you could never consolidate onto a bus and drive into town. Maybe that's why, all these long years later, the folks who lived it still get a lump in their throat when they hear a bell ring out across an open field. Which of these do you remember? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one.